Welcome to the third plenary session. I'm Bruce Marshall with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. Before we get to this morning's presentation, there are some important awards to announce and some people to thank for their contributions to the conference. As you know, this third plenary is typically focused on an important clinical topic, and so it is the perfect venue to publicly recognize CF centers and their multidisciplinary teams for their outstanding work. Someone at yesterday's plenary used the phrase, "It takes a village," and indeed, it takes a village of professionals to support and serve the healthcare needs of people with CF and their families as they face the daily challenges of this disease. Each one of you is an important member of that village: nurse, physician, social worker, dietitian, respiratory therapist, psychologist, pharmacist, physical therapist, and others. You each bring unique training and experience to the mission. The strong partnerships and deep relationships that you form help sustain people with CF through the rough patches and hopefully provide personal and professional satisfaction to those of you working on their behalf. As a means of recognizing the great work that occurs at care centers across the U.S. and around the world, the CF Foundation created the Quality Care Awards in 2008. This award is given annually at this conference to those centers demonstrating a sustained commitment to quality improvement with tangible results. Importantly, this award reflects recognition from peers on the Center Committee. The Center Committee is comprised of an amazing group of pediatric and adult program directors who work tirelessly and selflessly to ensure standards of care are met and to drive improvement. They've been very busy this past year, visiting 67 pediatric, adult, and affiliate programs across the U.S. Only those programs that they site visited in this past year were considered for this year's Quality Care Award. This morning, I'm thrilled to publicly recognize the following care centers for their outstanding work with the 2016 Quality Care Awards. Please hold your applause till the end as I read their names. Tucson Cystic Fibrosis Center, Keck Medical Center at USC, Children's Hospital of LA, Kaiser Permanente, Southern California, Alfred DuPont, Rush University, University of Chicago, Tulane University, Maine Medical Center, the Minnesota Cystic Fibrosis Center, Monmouth Medical Center, Nationwide Children's Hospital, Dayton Children's Hospital, Wright State University, Geisinger Medical Center, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, Children's Hospital of Wisconsin, and Froedtert and the Medical College of Wisconsin. Please join me in a round of applause. Congratulations to all the winners and to all the care center teams from around the world. We sincerely thank you so much for all that you do. Next, we'd like to recognize those care centers that have gone that extra mile in working with their local CF Foundation chapters. We know how very busy you are and sincerely appreciate this contribution in support of our shared mission. Care centers are nominated for consideration by their local foundation executive director, and final selections are made by a committee of CF Foundation staff in Bethesda at our national office. Next slide, please. And please hold your applause till the end as I read this year's Outstanding Partnership Award winners. East Tennessee Children's Hospital, Helen DeVos Women and Children's Center, Lutheran General Hospital, Nebraska Regional CF Care Center, St. Mary's Medical Center, Santa Barbara Cottage Hospital, SUNY Upstate Medical University, the Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Children's Medical Center, the University of Kentucky, and UNC at Chapel Hill. We at the national office and our colleagues at the local chapters greatly appreciate your support. Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Cindy George, Senior Director of Partnerships for Sustaining Daily Care, who will announce the winners of the Mary Contos Award.
Good morning. I am honored to present the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation's Mary M. Contos Care Champion Award. Mary Contos was a pediatric nurse practitioner and program coordinator at the Cystic Fibrosis Center at the Women and Children's Hospital of Buffalo. We remember her today with this award, presented to a non-physician member of the care team who has made significant contributions in the field of day-to-day care. Of the 14 highly qualified nominees, 2 were selected to receive this year's award. These individuals display Mary's passion for excellence, her commitment to improving the lives of people with CF through exceptional care and delivery, and a lifelong dedication to leading and pioneering advancements for the CF community. Our first recipient has been a leader in nursing for 23 years. She is described by parents, children, and adults with CF whom she has cared for over the years as being a positive, dependable, trustworthy angel. Her contributions have been numerous at both the local and national levels, most notably developing patient education materials and in quality improvement. I am proud to present this year's Mary M. Contos Award to Ginny Drapeau, CF Clinical Nurse Coordinator and Research Coordinator at the Central Connecticut Cystic Fibrosis Care Center.
I'd just like to say thank you to my fantastic care team for nominating me and for the foundation for choosing me. This has been a lifelong commitment for me because, as Patty Burke said, I used to be a CF mom. And this award just means so much to me because I met Mary at my first conference, and she took me under her wing and became my mentor long before there were any mentorship programs. And she would call me, she would help me. We did a few things together for conferences, and I am deeply touched and humbled for this. Thank you all.
Our second award recipient is a leading dietitian, described as caring and dedicated professional who has worked steadfast to improve nutritional outcomes for individuals with CF at her center and nationally since 1985. She generously shares her expertise, serving nationally as a dietitian mentor, as a member of the Foundation's Education and Guidelines Committee, and a contributor on numerous national publications. I am proud to award this year, second recipient of this year's Mary M. Contos Award to Karen McGinnis, CF registered dietitian at the Riley Hospital for Children, Indiana University Medical Center.
I just wanted to thank all the patients who have entrusted their care to me over the years, and to my colleagues, my care team, for all their mentoring of me, past, present, future. And I'm very humbled and grateful to the CF Foundation. Thank you.
Ginny and Karen, all of us thank you for being champions of care for our community. Again, one more round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cindy, and congratulations to Ginny and Karen. Some of us have been in CF care and research for a number of years, and some of us have gray hair. Some of us have no hair, and some may have dyed hair. I'm not sure about that. But I bring it up because it's a tangible sign that we must recruit and mentor the next generation of leaders in CF care and research. So to recognize and encourage the up-and-coming generation of investigators, we instituted the Junior Investigator Award for the best abstracts in basic science and clinical science. Selection committee had a difficult job this year. There were many high-quality abstracts. But in the end, they landed on the following junior investigators to receive this award. So the 2016 Junior Investigator Awards go to, for basic science, Megan at the University of Pittsburgh. My heart skipped a beat when I saw Megan's last name. And for clinical science, Ruth. Congratulations to the awardees and to all the young investigators who presented at this year's conference. We need you. Next, we'd like to recognize some people who played key roles in putting this conference together. As some of you know, planning for this conference takes an entire year. Preparations for the next year start shortly after the conference ends. The planning shifts into high gear with a face-to-face program planning committee meeting in January. This year was a little different. We hit a major roadblock, a winter storm, so we had to cancel the January meeting. Despite this challenge, we were able to pull together with the support of the meetings team and the IT group by video conferencing and get the framework of the conference laid down. And then we brought the working groups together and were able to polish off the conference. And I'm sure you will agree that we've got another great conference this year. So thanks to the meetings group, the IT group, the program planning committee. This slide shows Cynthia Adams and her amazing team. And the next slide shows the program planning committee. And I want to call out a couple of special individuals for a huge thanks. That's huge with an H, not huge with a Y. The co-chairs of the Program Planning Committee, Dr. George Rech Bogart and Dr. Jack Reardon, two very special people. George and Jack, please come forward to accept a small token of our appreciation. They did a great job in leading the Planning Committee, and they've contributed in so many ways over the years. George and Jack, if you're here, please come forward. If they're in the back, it may take them 10 minutes to walk up. We'll get them their awards. Okay, now for the for the fun part, the main course, and why we're all here. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to introduce this morning's speaker, Dr. Wayne Morgan, Professor of Pediatrics and Physiology at the University of Arizona and Vice Chair of Academics. Many of you are aware of Wayne's important contributions in CF, so I will just call out a couple of them. Wayne is the founding director of our Data Safety and Monitoring Board, a critical component of our clinical research infrastructure. Because of the collective work of Wayne, his co-leaders Lane Quittel and Dick Simon, and the members of the DSMB, Preston, Mike, and the rest of us in Bethesda sleep better at night. The work they do is really important. Wayne also serves as the founding chair of the scientific advisory group of the ESCF study, epidemiologic study of cystic fibrosis. This is the highly productive observational study sponsored by Genentech. As a personal aside, I first got to know Wayne when I was invited to join the advisory group. This was a big deal for me. It was really one of my first opportunities to contribute beyond my work at the University of Utah. And Wayne made a very strong impression on me. He's, for those of you who know him, he's an amazing man. Encyclopedic knowledge of the literature, scientific curiosity, masterful leadership skills, generous spirit, great sense of humor. I could go on and on. He just blew me away, and he's been a role model for me, and I suspect many others. His contributions have not gone unnoticed. By the way, the foundation awarded him the prestigious Talamo Award several years ago. So when I was preparing my comments to introduce Wayne, what I didn't know is how highly acclaimed he is in several other areas: respiratory physiology, asthma, pediatric sleep medicine. And in the interest of time, I will spare you the details, but I came away from a review of his resume thinking this man needs very little sleep. I can't imagine how he gets it all done. So when the registry committee met at the conference last year in Phoenix, Wayne was there and he brought up an idea. The idea was a plenary focused on the patient registry. Everybody was jazzed on the committee about this idea. And this next video captures some of their comments about the registry. If we can start the video, please.
The patient registry is a unique resource for CF. The patient registry was started in the 1960s and is a longitudinal collection of data from almost all patients cared for in CF care centers around the United States.
And it contains clinical data and demographic data and allows us to look at various risk factors and associations to help understand the course of the disease.
The registry has a positive impact on decision-making in clinical care because it has allowed us to embark on important research projects, quality improvement projects, and is also directly used in clinical care. In terms of clinical care, it's used to track individual outcomes over time in terms of such things as lung function, body mass index, and weight.
We've been particularly interested in the different kinds of bacteria that are isolated from the lungs of individuals with cystic fibrosis. And we've conducted 2 different studies using the registry. And we were able to find, thanks to the data in the registry, that the number of people with cystic fibrosis who have Pseudomonas aeruginosa, who have some of the Burkholderia species, for example, are actually declining among different age groups, which is really exciting.
The registry data can be used to improve care in a couple of different ways. First of all, we have these wonderful reports that we can generate for each individual patient that allows the care team to get together and really look at what's going on with the individual patient, assemble their data, and have a better understanding of what the individual patient's needs are at each visit. In addition, we can combine the data at a population level that can be used at each individual care center for the team to have a better idea of overall what they're doing, what they need to improve on, and what the overall trends are for the patient populations.
The registry data really complements our clinical trial research. In clinical trials, we test new therapies in a very controlled setting for safety and efficacy, and usually among about 200 to 300 patients. The registry allows us to understand how those therapies are then adopted into standard of care and their associated outcomes across thousands of patients. So it provides us a very powerful resource to better understand the impact of new therapies. Some of the challenges might be that it's more subject to missing data than clinical trials, but really the strength is in the numbers when it comes to the registry, and the fact that we have data on so many patients helps to mitigate some of these traditional problems inherent to observational research.
The patient registry has been fairly essential to research. First, it's the only way we document the natural history of CF and how it's changing over time. The next thing it's been useful is for us to understand different factors that may impact the future of CF patients, and these are called association studies.
The patients who consent for the registry are research partners. Their contribution to the registry have made so many positive research findings that we could not do without their data in the registry.
The people who are entering the data to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation Registry are absolutely essential to the enterprise. And it's really important that they recognize, that we recognize, that they're doing a great job.
Thanks very much, Bruce. I can't say how humbled and honored I am to talk about the work of so many individuals and the contributions of so many patients, parents, families, adults to this enterprise. Now, it seems appropriate at the time of the World Series, and I'm not taking sides, to quote Yogi Berra, who said, "You can observe a lot by just watching." And that's what this talk is about, is how do we watch and observe what we do and learn things. So in many ways, it's a story, which is appropriate because Yogi was pretty good with stories. So come along with me, and we'll tell you the story of the registry in particular, but epidemiology and CF, and maybe have some lessons along the way. First, I do have some disclosures. You can read them. So what is the CF Foundation Patient Registry? And let's start with its history. So in the beginning, in the 1960s, the CF Registry began with Warren Warwick in Minnesota, who started the registry, and as many know, passed away this past February, one of the giants in CF. Started looking at, we need to understand what's going on with this disease, more than just what we do, we need to know how we do it. And it grew into the 80s when Bob Bell joined the foundation and helped lead those efforts. And we had our first annual reports around 1986. And as Stacy Fitzsimmons became to be involved, a well-respected epidemiologist, we began to get some analyses from the registry. And finally, by 88, had the first registry report. In 1994, with the beginning of personal computers, we were able to send for you young folks these things called floppy disks instead of sending paper, but it was sent quarterly now. So instead of an annual report, it was every 3 months. And in 1999, in the early 2000s, with the work of Hebe Quinton and Jerry O'Connor at Dartmouth, we began to get these wonderful center reports that we'll look at during the talk, telling us what we're doing, how we're doing, and most importantly, how are the persons with CF we're caring for, how are our patients doing. By 2003, we moved to the Port CF web-based platform, and now point-of-service-based data, collecting what was going on in all clinic visits, which is critical if we want to know how we're treating patients, how they're doing in detail. That granularity is needed. By 2006, we had expanded medication collections, which of course had to happen because of the wonderful explosion of new medicines in CF. And in 2010, then expanded the diagnosis and microbiology section. And so the registry has become a very rich collection of data over decades, teaching us about what we do and how patients do. So what is the registry today? Well, the inclusion criteria are you have to be seen at a CFF accredited center, and there is an informed consent process, which is absolutely critical. The data are collected at diagnosis, at clinic visits. with hospitalizations or with home IV therapies, a focus on exacerbation, which I'll come back to, and annually. And I don't expect you to read this, get my arrow working, to read this large slide here, but I would encourage you to go online and take a look and download it and understand the wealth of data that exists in the registry. And if you are interested in asking questions, please feel free to download the Excel spreadsheet that's on the registry page, and you can look at the data that's available, because there's going to be a lot more questions that we can answer. The other important thing about the registry, of course, it reflects the CF Foundation. It is a nationwide effort, and these are all the centers that are involved across the country. Well, how comprehensive is it? And it turns out that based on birth rates in the US and CFTR allele prevalence, it's estimated there's about 34,500 individuals in the United States who have cystic fibrosis. 90% of those are seen at CFF accredited centers. And 94% are in the registry. Only 6% elect not to consent. And so in effect, if you do the numbers, 84%, we believe, of individuals in the United States who have cystic fibrosis are contributing, and I mean that wholeheartedly, contributing their data to the registry. And that's a very impressive effort. Now, one concern that we've had for years is, well, how good is the data? And we know how hard the coordinators work, but the CF Foundation in 2012 said, we better make sure this data is good. If we're going to make strategic decisions in planning, if we're going to do research, we have to know how good the data is. And so the registry team at the foundation went to 28 centers, stratified by size, by regionality, by other characteristics, and looked at 50 to 70 charts and related that source documentation to what was in the registry. How good is the data? Well, the first thing we're going to look at is how complete is the data. And what we see is that for date of birth, sex, race, Hispanic origin, lung function, height, weight, 95% plus of patients had that data in their registry. And 90 to 95% had their CFTR mutation in the registry, in fact 94%, and 90% of hospitalizations were captured. So that's very impressive. But then the next question is, if you captured that data, how accurate is it? And it turns out that for demographic variables, hospitalizations, anthropometric measures, height, weight for age, respiratory cultures, 95% or more is accurate, which is again phenomenal. For medications, though, we drop down to the 80 to 90%. So let's blow that up a little and look at it and see where we have some challenges. So it turns out that for enzymes, 99% are accurate. For Dornase alpha, 94%. For azithromycin, 90%. And where it becomes a bit more difficult is with some inhaled medications. With hypertonic saline, which is barely almost 90%, but then again for inhaled antibiotics, because of course they're given every other month. And so depending on when you're seeing the patient and when the data is being entered, it can get to be confusing for the team entering it. Nonetheless, we still captured almost 85% accurately. So at the end of the day, as in Emily Knapp's paper, which I would encourage you to read in the Annals, pointed out, this is a very comprehensive, very complete, and remarkably accurate effort. Now, it's very important that I point out that I'm focusing today, particularly on the CF registry, and as you'll see in a moment, on lung issues, on pulmonary disease. But I want to recognize that there are a number of wonderful registries around the world that are capturing similar data, and it is a real effort to begin to start working together and collaborating to share data and to look at how does care work in different countries, how do outcomes work. The other thing I would like to highlight as well is, as Bruce said, and he was part of it, I've had the honor of being the co-chair with Mike Constan of the epidemiologic study of CF, which was a phase 4 epi study funded for 25 years by Genentech. There's a lot of folks working in registries. So where are we now? We're going to tell this story. Let's look at some snapshots, like when you go through a family album. Well, the first thing we've talked about at many meetings is how there's been a dramatic improvement in survival. In the last 30 years, there's a 12% improvement so that we're now at 40 years of age. And that's wonderful news, but as Dr. Flume pointed out, that's not the moon. That's the rocket with the flames and the smoke, and it's starting to move, but we're not to the moon yet. And further evidence of that is that the median age of death in 2015 was in the third decade of life, in the late 20s. And so we still have a lot of climbing and a lot of hard work to do. And that's what makes this meeting so inspirational and so exciting. And if you run the DSMB, terrifying, because there's going to be 50 new studies. And so this is going to change. And I would point out that all these data, of course, reflect the era before modulators. And so we expect it to get better and better. A new metric that will appear in the registry this year from 2015 is life expectancy by age. In other words, in the orange bars, if you have achieved a certain age, what is your calculated additional years of life expected in white? And so we see that for the majority of patients who are under 20, the estimated age is around the mid-40s, the median survival. But for those older patients, the people who've survived, their expected life goes up higher and higher. And again, this is before the modulators. They can't have affected this yet. And so it's only going to get dramatically better. Another story we can tell, another snapshot we can take, as Lisa Simon said, is looking at the respiratory microbiology. Now, when you look at this in the report, what you want to realize is this does not represent a given individual's course through lifetime. This is looking at, if you're a young child, what are you likely to find? And it's H. flu. As you turn into the early preteen years, it's Staph aureus. As you become older, older patients have more Pseudomonas, and of course more methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. And in the oldest population, we begin to see more multiple drug-resistant Pseudomonas, because the more we treat with drugs, the greater risk of resistance. On the other hand, they work because you've actually lived and you may have MDR, but you're alive and you're doing well. So we do see those changes. There are other organisms that occur at low rates across the lifespan, and that a lot of work is going into trying to understand what they mean and what their impact on disease is. Now, Salzgiver, looking at CFF registry data, did a nice analysis recently, looking at the chains in the prevalence of these organisms from 2006 to 2012. And what we see is not much change in Staph aureus, a reduction in H. flu and Pseudomonas, a striking increase in MRSA, but in fact it actually reflects the increase in methicillin-resistant Staph aureus seen in the general community. And about 2/3 or so of these are health care acquired based on their typing, and about 1/3 are community acquired. And Burkholderia continues to go down. So the registry allows us to track changes in the ecology of the lung as we use different treatments. And that's important for strategic planning and offers, as in Salzgiver's papers, opportunity for science. Perhaps the most important part of the registry as it's matured is the ability to look at the care that we give. And not merely because we can ask questions, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, about what it does, but because we have to understand as caregivers and as patients, parents, and families who really understand the burden, how do we manage this? These are the medications captured in the registry now. That's a lot of medicines. This is the percent of individuals eligible who get it. So for beta agonists, it's almost 100%. For ivacaftor, it's in the high 90s. But let's break this down a little bit and say, well, everybody gets chest physiotherapy, so there's another one. I'm sure for those of you out there that are patients or families, there's another new medicine? Yay! Oh, wow, how am I going to do it? Let's look at hypertonic saline. Consider Dornase alpha. Throw in an inhaled antibiotic. This triple cocktail of inhaled medications is used by 1 in 3 persons with CF, in addition to their chest physiotherapy. That's a lot of work. That takes tremendous commitment. And so recognizing that and the complexity of the care burden, the CF Foundation has developed the Partnerships for Sustaining Daily Care initiative. And that brings together what the healthcare providers can tell patients and families, parents and families and adults about the quality of CF care. What should we do? But far more importantly, it allows us to learn from families and patients about what they can tell us about the disease that they live with and that they struggle with and they fight, and about the impact of that burden. And so this has a research arm, the Success with Therapies Research Consortium, and also has other arms looking at learning more. And I think this is probably one of the most important initiatives right now that the CF Foundation is conducting. And I'd encourage you to go to cff.org to learn more about it. Now, as survival improves, the demographics improve dramatically as well. And so we have 10,000 more adults with CF in the United States now than we did in 1986. And observing that change, the Foundation took a very proactive approach to developing adult CF programs with adult providers and experts in the field of adult medicine. And that has changed the experience from one of a 40 or 50-year-old person seeing a pediatrician who can't quite get rid of his pediatric genes, to seeing an adult doctor who will treat them as an adult. Tremendously important. We can also use a registry to look at the experience of adults with cystic fibrosis. And so here we see the percentage of CF adults who are college graduates, the percent who are student or employed, and the percent that are married or living together. This is the data from the CDC for the United States as a whole. And you can see that what CF adults have achieved very much reflects the adult population in the United States with a rather higher rate of going to college. What it doesn't reflect is the tremendous energy, commitment, hard work that families, the patients, the young adults had to do to get there. And it's a tremendous accomplishment. So that's the snapshots of where we're at, where are we going, how are things changing, strategic planning, new initiatives. How do we learn about CF and its care? What can we learn about the science of cystic fibrosis? Well, the first thing I'd like to point out is that with the increased initiative and building a wonderful CF registry team at the foundation with superb epidemiologists and biostatisticians and operations managers, there's been an increase in the use of the registry and an increase in publications. We want to see that, like a moonshot as well, take off. And we'll talk about that more at the end of the talk. So Ted Lieu, who is, I think, the guru of survival analyses in CF, came up with a very elegant analysis that he presented in the American Journal of Epidemiology in 2001. And what he did was he expressed risk factors for survival or against survival, but he expressed them in terms of an equivalent loss of lung function. So for example, if I can get my arrow up here, if you're a female, being a female gives you the equivalent of about a 5% loss in lung function. If you're pancreatic sufficient, it gives you the equivalent of an improvement of about 12%, and so on down the line. As you can see, if you have Burkholderia cepacia, which we know reflects Xenocepacia in particular strains, that's the equivalent of being about 48% down. So very compelling information. But look at this bottom bar here. That's a pulmonary exacerbation. That's a single pulmonary exacerbation in a year. So imagine what happens, as Ted pointed out, if you expand this to 4 exacerbations, you're now sitting right there. And so exacerbations, we know, and we're learning more about them, are an important part of when we lose lung function and when patients get into trouble. The other thing that's been able to work with epidemiological data that's come out is that bringing together basic scientists, geneticists, molecular biologists with a rich database, including elegant twin and SID pair studies, we're able to understand the mutations and their impact on outcomes. Now, this is a somewhat simpler version than the 6-class version, but it's because that's what we have good epidemiology data for. There are 3 classes that are severe mutations. Class 2, of course, is the F508del mutation, and class 3, one example would be G551D. And there are 2 classes that are felt to be mild mutations. Well, why do we believe this? In this paper from Ed McCone in Lancet in 2003, if we look at age of diagnosis, which was mostly by clinical indication, so before newborn screening was fully nationwide, we see that patients with severe mutations are diagnosed younger, have lower lung function, are more likely to be pancreatic insufficient, and are more likely to have Pseudomonas aeruginosa. But unfortunately also, and not surprisingly given those risk factors, have a higher rate of mortality. And this mortality is in 1,000-person years. So in 1,000 patients, people with I'm sorry I keep goofing up with the arrow, it's because I don't see it here. The class 2 regulation mutations, 16 people in 1,000 would die in that year. In contradistinction, for the mild mutations, it's much lower. And so with the CFTR2 work that Dr. Cutting and others are doing, we're learning more about what these mutations mean. And Dr. Cutting and his team have done elegant work beginning to understand, well, we understand mutations more, but what contributes to phenotype, how the patient looks clinically, how they're doing. And it turns out that's a very complicated story. First and foremost, we can divide it into 3 categories. The impact of your CF mutation, of CFTR genotype, genetic modifiers, other genes in your body that influence the expression of CF mutations, and then finally environmental, the care you get, the treatments you receive, the environment you live in, or stochastic, random events, a child who gets parvovirus or influenza and gets very ill. How do these contribute to phenotype? Well, it turns out that if we look at exocrine insufficiency, pancreatic insufficiency, driven by CF genotype, that tells the story. If we look at the risk and age of onset of diabetes or intestinal obstruction risk, that's driven much more by other genes that a lot of work has gone into beginning to understand, because they not only help us understand the mechanisms of disease, they could potentially represent therapeutic inroads that we could make. When we move over to Pseudomonas aeruginosa infection, body mass, and particularly lung disease, airway obstruction, we see now that actually CF genotype doesn't play a very large role. You have to have it to have CF, but the gene modifiers are almost half, and that environmental care and random events play a very large role. And that's why we see so much phenotypic variation within a family, where one child might be very ill and the other child might be healthy as a young adult. But understanding this variation by combining molecular biology with epidemiology will help us develop better therapies for this disease. Now, in the ESCF study, one of the therapies that we wanted to focus on was nutrition and growth. We're pediatricians, most of us. We have internists like Bruce, who was on it for many, many years, and others. But we view that a child's job is to build big lungs, healthy lungs. That's our goal. We want to hand off that 18 or 21-year-old to the adult program with great lung function. And so Mike Constant and the team, we decided to look at the relationship between growth at 3 years of age, in this case, weight for age, and lung function at 6 years of age, FEV1 when it could be first measured. Where high lung function, of course, is here, and more obstructed lungs, or at least lower FEV1s are there. And what Mike found was that those children with the lowest lung function were also the children who had the lowest weight for age. And it turned out that even when you adjusted for Pseudomonas, crackles in the chest, other signs of lung disease, this didn't change. In fact, it got stronger. And so then we said, well, is it obstruction? Are the airways blocked? And it's not. It's small lungs. I could put forced vital capacity, the size of the lungs on there, and I'd get the same graph. So the bottom line is, it appears if you are not growing well, if you are nutritionally behind, your body sacrifices lung growth to presumably grow other organs like your brain, which is a good idea. But it does hurt the lung. Now, this was fairly old data now. The ESCF's been around 25 years. And so D.B. Sanders, working with the registry, published in JPEDS in 2015, a different look at this. Is it still this way? And it turns out, if you look at the age when you first reach the 50th weight for age percentile and relate that to your FEV1% predicted again at 6 years of age, those children who were always at the 50th percentile or achieved it by age 1 had the best lung function at all. Newborn screening, early diagnosis, aggressive intervention nutritionally. And those children who were not able to, who never got to the 50th percentile, had meaningfully lower lung function. Importantly, he also showed that if you improved your lung function, there was a dramatic, if you improved your weight for age over that time frame, your lung function went up dramatically as well. So when that nutritionist is working hard to help that child gain weight and grow, it's very important, not only for body health and growth, but for growing strong lungs. Because once they're growing, they do decline. And if we look at the decline in lung function with age, what do we see? And here we've combined data from Mike Constant and the ESCF, these are the yellow bars, and from Elliot Dazenbrook at the CF Foundation last year. And this is the mean FEV1 decline per year in percent predicted, depending on the age group that we're talking about. And what you see is that for those difficult years, that 9 to 21, the preteen through the young adult, is where the greatest decline occurs. So what's associated with decline? And there's been a number of exciting studies helping us understand the risk factors for accelerated decline. And they are female sex, low body mass percentile, having crackles in your lung. When the doctor hears your chest and says there's crackles, that's a worrisome finding. Pseudomonas infection. In the EPIC observational study, Margaret Rosenfeld's the PI, Dr. Kogan did an analysis. EPIC observational, there's not a lot of Pseudomonas because they enrolled before they got Pseudomonas. And their staff is now associated with more rapid declines. Burkholderia, exacerbations come up again. A surprising variable, which has been shown in center-specific studies and in our work in ESCF and by others, is that having high lung function, the healthiest appearing child, the 102%er, is more rapidly going to decline, more likely to have a rapid decline, not the child that's 50% predicted, or the adult. And this works in adults as well. And then finally, as we published in Journal of Pediatrics this past year, FEV1 variability. When you look at the FEV1 plots and they're going up and down and up and down, they're not going up and down and up and down. They're going up and not quite up and not quite up and not quite up and not quite up. And they're going down. And so looking at variability, we believe, is very important. Now, if we look at things that predict low rates of decline, pancreatic sufficiency, wheezing, your genotype, and diagnosis by newborn screening. Early intervention, treating that Pseudomonas, good nutrition. So back to exacerbations. D.B. Sanders has done very important work helping us understand the impact of a pulmonary exacerbation. Now, this is a very schematic diagram of somebody who's going along well, gets sick, and then gets better. We don't really know if it drops like that. It may be that it drops more like this. But the bottom line is when they're seen for the exacerbation, it's usually down. It's usually down about 20% sometimes. He then looked at baseline lung function, the best in the 6 months prior, and then followed out through time and said, what recovery do we see? And at 3 months, 75% have gotten back to 90% of the baseline. At 6 months, 81, and by the end of the year, 85% have gotten back to 90% of the baseline. When I was in high school, 85% was a good grade. But it means something else. 15% of patients failed to recover. That's 1 in 7 who have an exacerbation. 90% of their baseline FEV1. So a young woman who's 100% predicted at age 20, or age 18 or age 12, has an exacerbation, loses on average, let's say 18, 20%. 1 in 7 of those individuals will only get back to 90. That's a loss of 10% of predicted. That's 4 to 5 years of decline related to one event. And so exacerbations we need to learn a lot more about. And as Patrick Flume talked about, there's now the STOP2 program that he and Chris Goss and the Foundation are working on. And there's even an effort to look at how do we look at exacerbations in children. We have to understand them, how to prevent them, how to treat them. Now, one of the things that predicts them, based on work from Dutch van de Vendter, is that having one predicts them. My daddy, who liked to go to the races, said if they ran well in the mud, you bet on them when it rained. And it turns out that if you have exacerbations, you're likely to have more, as though the disease becomes accelerated. And so that means that we really have to pay attention to our patients that are having repeated exacerbations. And as Dr. Waters showed with Toronto data, we have to pay attention because compared to those, if I get my arrow working, who had never had an exacerbation in their analysis in the year that they looked at, they only lost 1% predicted. People who had one lost 1.8%. So exacerbations eat away at lung function, and we have to learn more about them. Now in ESCF, we decided that, well, exacerbations are when somebody's sick, right? That often is a key component. Cough, fever, weight loss, malaise, increased sputum, change in color of sputum, maybe a drop in lung function. But we're mostly lung docs, and so we decided to look at, well, what about if just lung function goes down? How do we treat people? Because our hypothesis was, if having high lung function puts you at risk for more rapid decline, is that because we don't treat patients with high lung function? Well, let's see. So in this analysis that we published in JPEDS, we looked at individuals who'd had at least a 10% decline in lung function. So compared to baseline, they were down 10%. Turns out the average is 18% in kids and 19% in teenagers. It's a big drop. Well, if you had low lung function, get my arrow working again, if you had low lung function, then about 50% of those people received treatment with IVs. Now, a higher percentage, about 70 or 80, received oral antibiotics, but only 50% got IV treatment for on average a 20% lung function loss. But the healthier you were, the higher your baseline lung function was, the less likely you were to be treated. And so, in fact, if you look at the top 3 deciles, only 25% got treated. And if you compare the highest decile, the best lung function patients, to the lowest, the odds of the healthiest being treated, the odds ratio was 0.15, almost non-existent. And that's completely illogical, because if you have 100% lung function and you lost 20% of it, you lost a lot more lung function than somebody who was 50% and lost 20%. And also, in a disease that we know accelerates, that exacerbations predict exacerbations, we could be missing the chance to stop that if we're not treating healthy patients. Now, I explicitly recognize, because I do it, how do you treat that child that's got her volleyball tournament in Phoenix for the state championship? What do you do with the young man that's got to go for his job interview in Colorado? It's hard. You have to fit life into these decisions, but we are systematically, at least in the olden times of ESCF, appeared not to be treating healthy people as aggressively as we should. Well, Josh Estrenga, who's one of the biostatisticians, epidemiologists at the CF Foundation, graciously redid the analysis in the 2015 data. And como dice en español Toussaint, es lo mismo, no cambiaron nada. We didn't change a thing. But to go back to these studies, what we learned about in the clinical trials lecture, and it's so many wonderful talks at this meeting, efficacy or clinical trials, that gives us, does the drug work, and also is it safe? They are detailed trials, they're well organized. Certain patients may be excluded from them because they're high risk. They have frequent visits, they have standardization of management. As we learned yesterday, there's better adherence when you're in a study. People take care of themselves better. But there's the real world, the one that we work in and the patients and families work in. Now, the real world is everybody who might benefit might see that medication or that intervention. There's less frequent visits. There's less standardization of management. There's a longer duration of therapy. And adherence, as we learned, probably isn't as good. But that's effectiveness. That's what we want, what happens in the real world. So can we analyze that? Here's the problem. It's called confounding by indication. Right? As my granny used to say in her Scots accent, everybody dies in hospitals. I don't want to go to one. That's confounding by indication. And Rothman and Wentworth addressed this with Toby. And they did an elegant analysis in 2003 where they looked at, for those who took tobramycin in 1998, how were they doing in 1999? What was their mortality? And if you just ask that question, those getting tobramycin had a higher mortality rate, 2.8. But they said, we've got to adjust for other things like age, sex, FEV1, Pseudomonas. And then when you adjust for those risk factors, you get down to 1.2. And they then said, we're going to actually enter people in this analysis who could have entered the clinical trial. And then it was 1.06. But then Greg Sawicki recently, in 2012, redid an analysis of survival after Toby with a broader data set from the registry. And most importantly, at a time when tobramycin was being given in a more systematized manner. More like the Children's Oncology Group. If you get this drug, period, no questions, you're getting the drug. As opposed to, gee, I think he's sick, we ought to start the Toby. That old way of doing things is what Rothman was wrestling with. What Sawicki had is a time when it is used in a more regular manner, and so he was able to show a 21% reduction in mortality for Toby, and in fact in this paper as well, a 15% reduction for Pulmozyme. So we can look at effectiveness. One of the earliest studies looking at effectiveness actually was to look at Dornase alpha. And Charlie Johnson and Mary Ellen Wold did this in ESCF back in the 90s. And if we look at percent predicted, at baseline, those who got Dornase alpha had much lower lung function than those who didn't. However, they did improve, whereas those who didn't get it actually slowly declined. And that was one of the earliest CER type of analyses that we've done with registry type data. And in fact, after adjustment for cohort differences, it was a 4% improvement, suggesting again that in the real world, not quite as good as a clinical trial, but reflecting those results. Now, as we move to what I like to consider the modern era of CF care, the modulator era, Greg Sawicki was able to look at the impact of ivacaftor on G551D patients, comparing those to registry controls delta F508 homozygotes. And he looked at many things. I'm just showing you the rate of decline, and we saw this on a slide from Dr. Flume yesterday. The rate of decline is meaningfully diminished when you follow long-term in the registry individuals getting ivacaftor compared to controls. I would encourage you, if you haven't seen them, to look at these two posters at this meeting. where in fact if you look at lumacaftor, ivacaftor in DEL 508 homozygotes and compare that to registry controls, you see the same thing, about a 50% reduction. And so there really is a signal here that we're having the kind of changes we want to have. But you can also use a registry to look at something you're worried about. And there was a really significant concern in the early 2000s through 2010 that being on chronic macrolides, azithromycin, could potentially lead to more infection with non-tuberculous mycobacteria. And that would be very problematic, of course, because we need to use azithromycin to treat it. And so Binder and Ken Olivier and that group looked at this in registry data and found that in CFFPR patients with new NTM in 2011, that on the order of the mid-30s were taking azithromycin or clarithromycin. In those who didn't get NTM from 2010 to 2011, there actually was, I'm sorry, I gotta say this again. In those who were getting azithromycin, there was a lower rate of getting NTM. In those who were not getting azithromycin, there was a higher rate. So that when you did the forest plot again, what you found was that if you looked at historical macrolide use, there was a lower risk of getting non-tuberculous mycobacteria. And so that helped put that fear a little bit to rest, which doesn't mean that we don't follow people closely to make sure they're not getting NTM on azithro. But it does mean that at least we can look at this data and feel more comfortable that it may be suppressing that growth. So how do we put it together? Wouldn't it be nice if it was like this? If you knew the genetic defect, you could go right to survival and well-being and then figure out how to treat it. But as Ted Lewis proposed, it's a little more complicated. And that doesn't even layer in treatment. That doesn't layer in mental health and well-being, a family and a patient's response to the disease, the realities of life, the social network, healthcare insurance. It's a very complex picture that we need something like the registry to analyze. Well, how does it support care teams? You've all seen, those of you that get registry reports, this kind of a report, and it is lung function by all the centers in the country, in this case for 6 to 17 years of age. And your center might be right there, and you're feeling kind of okay, but you want to get right there and have better lung function. And if your center's down here, you need to do something. That's the kind of information centers have had now for almost 20 years, at least 15, to improve outcomes. You can look at how your center's changing. Is your center getting better or following the median as the center is? Most importantly, care teams can download data on a given individual, and this is blanked out, of course, and look at things like the trend in lung function. This patient's doing pretty well. Look at the trend in weight gain. Isn't that wonderful? That kind of information, looking back over time, is critical to making care decisions and to teaching and coaching families and patients. Because we've got to remember, no football coach ever won teaching the team 4 times a year, and that's about all we get is 4 visits a year. And so it's very important that we're able to educate families, patients, parents to help meet the goals that they need to meet. So can we do anything with this data? And to me, this is the most important slide in this talk. Mike Schechter at Virginia Commonwealth University Pediatric Program looked at his data for his center and looked at 2009 through 2012, and that's how they were doing. Below the median for FEV1, low lung function, and certainly not in the best. And so he said, we have to change something. And so he implemented a quality improvement program where if you've lost from 5 to 10%, you might get an oral antibiotic. If you're sick, you do. If you've lost more than 10%, you do get an oral antibiotic. But you come back in 1 month. If your lung function's not back up, something happens. You might well get admitted or get home IVs. So careful attention to those little drops in lung function before they become big drops in lung function and variability. Well, did that make a difference? Yeah, as my daughter would say. Look at how that lung function has improved in a very short, actually my granddaughter, I'm old now, she's 12. Look at how that's improved. That's what you can do by watching, by observing, and by asking questions. So how has the foundation partnered to create change? Well, obviously I believe that the registry is a very important part of that partnership, that the care centers are critical. We have quality improvement programs, the learning and leadership collaboratives to help facilitate teams become effective in their care and in their quality improvement. The peer review process that Bruce talked about earlier. Evidence-based practice guidelines. Benchmarking to learn from best practices. I assure you, when I go home, Corey Daines and I are going to talk, and we'll see what can we do with Mike's algorithm. But the most important change is now engaging people with CF and their families in this process. And the Foundation is doing this at every level of its efforts and its initiatives. So what comes next? We have a lot more to do. We need to continue to use this rich database, this registry, collaborate with other national registries to improve care and learn more about CF as a disease and its treatments and how they work. We have to use a registry as the burden, in quotes, gets bigger and bigger. How do we begin to wrestle with all these different medicines? But I would argue we need to look at what we're doing. We don't want any more deja vu all over again. We want to increase the value of the registry at point of care, help with decision-making process, help with highlights when things aren't going well. We have to recognize limitations. Clinical trials are still the core of clinical science for all the reasons we talked about earlier. But importantly, we also want to recognize limitations in the registry in other ways. We don't have enough data on transplants. And so the Foundation is working on collaborating and harmonizing with the transplant registry. We want to grow the ability to answer questions. And the most important thing is that we want to invite the cystic fibrosis community, and that includes persons with CF and their families. We want to include them actively in participating in asking research questions, because they know CF. I want to acknowledge some folks involved in all this work. Of course, the most important people, the patients and their families, who've contributed, and I mean as a gift, this data and this knowledge. I want the CF data coordinators who've ever sat there and plugged stuff in to stand up and get a round of applause. Your efforts have been amazing, and the data is good. In fact, it's great. The CF Foundation leadership has always had a vision for this registry and where it can move forward and how to collaborate. The registry committee chairs, the people that should have been giving this talk, I'm just saying, Chris Goss and Elliot Dazenbrook, who are wonderful leaders and bring us together, and also, of course, the whole committee, the folks on this video that you've seen and others you're going to see in a moment. The clinicians and researchers who go, you know, I'm wondering about this. Let me talk with Bruce Marshall and see if I can ask a question. That's what we need. And now we want patients and families. And of course, the registry team at the Foundation, Bruce's leadership. I won't read all the names. I will say that for this talk, Eliza Fink, Josh Estrenga, and Dina Leffler played a very critical role in helping me tell this story. And Dutch van de Vanner, as usual, did his Michelangelo slides for me. Well, you know what they say, or at least what he said, it ain't over till it's over. So please stay for a video. Thank you.
I think that as we look towards the future of the CF Patient Registry, not only are we collecting information on our patients in the clinic, but we're also very fortunate that other groups are collecting information and databases about CF patients. And so combining these databases really provides a unique opportunity for our patients in the CF community to improve their care.
The next steps with leveraging registry data is to begin to do prospective studies like the STOP2 study. We can track long-term outcomes after an initial intervention to make sure that our interventions both help patients in the short term and the long term.
The registry has been instrumental in both the design of that study, and it's going to prove very important in understanding the results of that study.
In the future, as more CFTR modulators are studied and hopefully become available to our patients, it will be really important to track their use in the CF Patient Registry. It's a very exciting future to be able to see patients getting therapies that are new and potentially modifying their disease trajectory.
What's exciting about the future of research using the CF Patient Registry is that for the first time through the Insight Research Project, CF patients and families will be able to submit ideas that will be turned into research projects.
Patients and families are having the opportunity to indicate what's important to them and then be able to work alongside researchers to study ways to better improve cystic fibrosis care.
Thank you, Wayne, for a great presentation. We're looking to the CF community to help us create the research agenda for the registry going forward. What matters to you? Please share this link about the Insight CF project with your care team members, your patients, and their family members, and encourage them to get involved in this initiative and submit their ideas. Enjoy the rest of the conference and hope to see you at the party tonight. Thank you.